Hello everyone, my name is Stamatis Zografos. I am an architect and associate professor at UCL Bartlett School of Architecture. I'm honored to be invited to give this presentation, albeit virtually at this pavilion, and share my insights on the concept of the archive. Over the years, I have delved deeply into this concept, not only through my research and art practice, but also in my role as a history and theory tutor at Bartlett. For the last 8 years, I have been running a series of history and theory seminars on architecture and memory for final year architecture students that closely address the multifaceted dimension of the archive. As a result of our mutual interest in this topic, I have asked Johnathan, one of my former architecture students and a recent Bartlett graduate, to join this presentation and introduce some of his fascinating thoughts on archives.
Hello everyone, my name is Johnathan. I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to join the presentation at this virtual pavilion. When I was studying at the Bartlett School of Architecture, I explored the role of the digital archive in training AI generative design algorithms. And this research led me to write my dissertation on digital archives titled The Invisible Hand from the Cloud. My part of this presentation will be some of the findings that I curated in this learning journey.
In this talk, we will approach the concept of archives from two distinct perspectives. I will focus on physical archives, while Johnathan will primarily address the notion of digital archives. We will offer two parallel narratives which can either stand alone independently or complement each other when considered together as one voice. We will develop arguments drawing on multiple disciplines such as archival and digital theory, memory studies, philosophy, psychoanalysis, geography, and environmental studies, and addressing a pathology of contemporary culture that has to do with a seemingly hysterical, nearly fetishized relationship to memory. We will eventually propose an approach to archives that allows for their partial distraction. Archives are most commonly perceived as spaces destined for the storage and preservation of records. These records are arranged following the rules of an elaborate classification system, and they are found in a state of stasis until someone retrieves them for research purposes. The processes that take place within an archive are complex and sophisticated, reflecting the narrations about the multiple operations unfolding silently in the National Library of France in Paris in Alain René's 1957 documentary Toute la mémoire du monde, or All the Memory in the World in English. In the following extract, the narrator of the documentary refers to a book of this library that is suddenly chosen amongst other records.
Ce n'est plus le même livre. À l'instant, il faisait partie d'une mémoire universelle, abstraite, indifférente, où tous les livres étaient égaux entre eux, où ils bénéficiaient tous ensemble d'une attention aussi tendrement glacée que celle de Dieu pour les hommes. Et le voici choisi, préféré, indispensable à son lecteur, arraché à sa galaxie pour nourrir ces faux insectes croqueurs de papier, irrémédiablement différents des insectes, en ceci qu'ils sont attelés chacun à une besogne distincte.
The selection of records is usually intentional and follows a rational searching process through the long catalogues of the archive. Yet, it is not uncommon that records are accessed unintentionally and counted through a process of serendipity. Likening these to an archival flânery, Mike Featherstone remembers the unorthodox searching methods of historians Norbert Elias and Michel Foucault, who accessed documents randomly, and I quote, on the diagonal, so that the unusual juxtapositions they arrived at summoned up new lines of thought and possibilities to radically rethink and reclassify received wisdom, end of quote. Archives are therefore sites of potential discoveries where the work of the researcher resembles the one of the archaeologist. They both dig into unmapped territories, searching for historical clues and interpreting them in ways that give credible glimpses of the past. The perception of archives as static depositories of ordered records has prevailed since Hilary Jenkinson's publication of a Manual of Archive Administration in 1922. For Jenkinson, who was a leading figure in early archival theory in Britain, archives, and I quote, themselves state no opinion, voice no conjecture. They are simply written memorials authenticated by the fact of their official preservation, of events which actually occurred and of which they themselves formed a part, and provide an exact statement of facts, end of quote. Archives are understood as passive, disinterested, and fixed entities that reveal one truth. A temporal dimension of their existence is unique and linear as they rise from stillness to movement until they return back to their original place for storage. More recent debates on archival theory, however, disregard the sole truth behind archives. In the light of postmodernism, the world cannot be adequately explained and justified in a single unified approach. Thus, this one truth must become a series of contingent truths. Roland Barthes' Death of the Author, for instance, accepts that the author's intention is detached as soon as writing begins and comprises one of the first postmodern concepts to clearly confront Jenkinson's one truth. Yet, the most influential person to determine the future of archives is the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, where we will be looking more closely into his theories later on.
Before I introduce my narrative, I would like to share a story from Plato. It is a dialogue about memory techniques between the king of Egypt and the god of arithmetic and writing, who says that, and I quote, "It will produce forgetfulness in the soul of those who learn it because they will cease to exercise their memory and will put their trust in what is written when they remember, in what is outside, in external print instead of what is on the inside in themselves. Therefore, it is not memory, but reminding for which you have found the remedy. As to knowledge, it is only the semblance of it that you procure for your disciples and not the reality." End quote. The story refers to the memory technique of writing or reminding and shows the indeterminate state between remedy and the poison of forgetfulness. Bernard Stiegler, a French armed robber turned philosopher, introduced the idea of the pharmakon to describe these contradicting characters. So pharmakon is a Greek word. It can be translated to English as both poison and remedy. Don't worry, this is the only Greek word I will use in this presentation. But I will be using this concept to analyze memory technologies, namely the digital archive, its role as remedy to the obsession with memory, and its role as the poison. In this presentation, I will first analyze the development in memory technologies and how this interacts with the evolution of culture. And then with this insight, I will attempt to give a reason for the contemporary obsession with memory. And lastly, explain the violent poison in the remedy of memory technology that promises to cure memory obsession. This is the pharmakon. So remember, the word pharmakon can be translated as both poison and remedy.
I will now turn to my monograph Architecture and Fire, a psychoanalytic approach to conservation that was published in 2019 by UCL Press. As the title suggests, in this book I explore the relationship between buildings and fire. There is a general assumption by historians and theorists that architecture emerged around fire. Vitruvius, in his book De Architectura, explains that the accidental discovery of fire is what, and I quote, originally gave rise to the coming together of men, to the deliberative assembly, and to social intercourse, end of quote. German architect and writer Gottfried Semper confirms that the fire of the hearth is, and I quote, fire first and the most important, the moral element of architecture, end of quote, around which three other elements came to emerge, namely the roof, the enclosure, and the mound. Fire is associated with construction in the myths of origin too. Estia, the Greek goddess of the hearth, or Vesta, the Roman one, were both central in architectural space and in the life of the city. Fire symbolized the beginning of creation and always occupied a central position in space. In this sense, fire comprises the first memory we have of the built environment. Before that, there is a dark, empty space associated with oblivion. Observing fire's proliferation in architectural space, buildings appear to function as porous entities that absorb and respond to the needs and demands of inhabitants. Knowledge gained as a result of observation on the success of existing buildings is applied to new buildings. When human needs and demands change, architecture adjusts itself accordingly through processes of experimentation. New building techniques, technologies, materials, and so on are tried out, and according to their performance, they are repeated or not in future structures. Yet, fire is one of the main reasons for architectural destruction. Therefore, fire is also architecture's last memory. Historically, the destruction of buildings caused by fire has driven societies towards the establishment of building regulations. In Architecture and Fire, I argue that, and this is a quote from my book, building regulations can be perceived as a space or an archive in which the memory of the accident and destruction is stored. It is an archive that remains static until an accident occurs. In this case, the archive is activated as new information is added to it. Then, through the enforcement of building regulations on new buildings, this traumatic memory of accidents is externalized and embodied in the architectural end product and manifests itself in its form, spatial arrangement, construction method, choice of materials, and so on. Architecture, on the other hand, as a shelter for these memories, has the function of an archive too. It is a static archive carrying a frozen memory of previous catastrophes. In case of a new accident, the architectural archive is activated and informs legislation through what's left behind, its ruins or ashes. Effectively, the memory of architecture's own catastrophe informs architecture itself in a vicious circle, end of quote. So, through the study of the relationship between architecture and fire, my intention is to highlight architecture's archival capacity, or else that buildings operate as archives.
As Stamatis mentioned in the opening of this talk, contemporary culture is characterized by a hysterical, if not fetishized, relationship to memory. Andrea Soysen refers to this period as, and I quote, the twilight of memory, due to its exhaustive obsession with memory's preservation. As a general rule today, we don't let memory go to waste, intentionally or not. We preserve every aspect of our contemporary life and culture, forming a huge, gradually expanding archive of countless memories that threatens to acquire the status of an aleph. The point in space that Jorge Luis Borges once witnessed, which contains the entire knowledge of, and I quote, the inconceivable universe. I will start the section by using an anecdote to analyze the development in urban memory preservation technologies and how this interacts with the evolution of culture that causes a contemporary obsession with memory. I recently moved to a neighborhood in South London, and when I was walking around the area, I found the facade of a 19th century Presbyterian church propped up by a cold grey steel lattice. It almost looked like scaffolding, and it is the type of structure that you might walk past and assume it will be taken down in a few weeks. However, the church facade is preserved to form the entrance to the newly planned lecture theatre of the London South Bank University. The new building will be for accommodating the growing number of students. Plenty of that growth come from international students who pay almost £30,000 a year. And this is a function that is completely detached from its heritage as a local religious gathering and worshipping space, and is a fate that the Victorian Presbyterians can hardly imagine, even with the most vivid imaginations. The enabling factor here is the reduction in cost in memory technologies. That is the facade retention technology in this example, which has become a trade of its own driven by demand. The invention of the skeletal construction system enabled the 20th century obsession with natural light in modernist buildings. They are technologically unsupported by curtain walls, using steel cables, ties, and beams from an industrialized and globalized supply chain, which enable the retention of the memory facade and therefore enable the contemporary obsession with memory. The bolting and tensioning of the facade make externalizing architectural memory comparatively effortless. It is hard to imagine that one would put construction resources on preserving a structurally unsound wall when the bricks can be recycled to build a much neater building if the resources required for preservation is financially unfeasible. The result of the technological progress in memory preservation, or remedy, is that only the site of memory is left, and the real communities of memory is poisoned and fed to the bulldozers. To the expense of a more meaningful embodied historical recalling, the local planners there have successfully approved the technique of reminding, which in this case is simply a facade that may remind people of the building that existed. The facade will be renovated to reveal its original near-mint condition when the smog and soot accumulated in the past of Victoria, London is cleansed. It will then be technologically retained externally as a time capsule snapshot. So far, I have focused on the role of memory technologies in enabling the obsession of memory. Memory technologies can remove the restraint for allocating resources between survival and memory. Next, I will try to explain how non-human technological factors work with human intentions that lead to memory obsession. However, the presentation is not about techno-determinism versus social constructivism and their relative significance, but rather it's focused on discussing and explaining contributing factors. The Canadian geographer Edward Ralph rightly points out that, and I quote, "The landscapes and places we live in are important. Whether we shape them or they shape us, they are expressions of what we are like," end quote. Given the privacy of the interior spaces where institutions, groups, and private individuals take shelter, work, and organize, the public-facing exterior facade of the cityscape in most cases serves to project these expressions to the public. It is therefore this element of publicity that makes the cultural memory of the exterior extremely relevant to our discussion. In our example, the meaning that the sculptural and architectural features convey are the intangible markers of the Presbyterian Church. These intangible markers on the facade form a matrix of mental maps of the city that produces the meta-language, the hierarchy of importance, and the legibility of the city, regardless of their intended legibility or the lack thereof. By preserving the tangible expression markers of the exterior and ordering destruction for the rest to externalize this architectural memory onto the facade, the meaning of these markers has mutated. This mutation is only possible after the poisoning of the operational function as a community religious gathering space, and the interior that reflects this function. The once mundane Victorian-styled facade of a local Presbyterian church has now become a dynamic accent in the mundane postmodern cityscape surrounding the site, in the middle of a frenzied facadism backdrop. The immediate poison of externalizing memory onto the facade to recall the place is the ability for the incumbent institution, instead of the local church, to engineer its image against the aura of a historic facade in any way that it sees fit. The London South Bank University, as the new owner of this preserved memory, seems to benefit from the historicity for its branding that it so badly lacks, given that it only achieved university status in 1992 when competing with other London universities that obtained their prestige in part through historicity.
In Archive Fever, French philosopher Jacques Derrida reassesses the notion of the archive, drawing on Freudian psychoanalysis. Archive Fever is a translation from the French of a lecture that Derrida gave at an international colloquium called Memory, the Question of the Archives, that took place at the Freud Archives in 1994 in London. In the opening note of Archive Fever, Derrida refers to the etymology of the word archive, which is the Greek word archi, or archi in Greek. This word has two meanings, commencement and commandment. On one hand, the archive reveals a certain desire to return to the absolute beginning or to the first memory. This is commencement. On the other hand, the archive can be seen to establish and enforce the law by deciding what's worth remembering, and by doing so, what will be forgotten. This is the commandment. The word archive also relates to the Greek word archeion, which refers to the building where the archons, or the chief magistrates in ancient Greece, resided. Part of the archons' political power was to give orders, to command, and it was at their residencies in the archaea where documents were kept safe and in order. This confirms one of the archive's main characteristics, that is violence. Violence occurs as soon as something is archived, because the act of archiving does not only imply the establishment of a law, but also its enforcement. An archive is thus the place where power is exercised. Derrida draws parallels between processes that take place in archives and the function of the mental apparatus as developed by Freud. In the 1926 essay called A Note About the Mystic Writing Pad, Freud introduces the mystic writing pad as a metaphor for the human mind and the process of recording and storing memories. The mystic writing pad is made of a piece of resin or wax covered with a transparent sheet attached to the top edge, containing two layers that could be separated except along the top and bottom edges. The upper layer is a transparent sheet of celluloid, and the bottom layer is made of a thin waxed paper. Whatever is written on the pad could be erased by separating the wax pad and the cover sheet without losing the initial writing. Freud therefore suggests that the pad functions like the unconscious, which is the area of the mind that houses deep-seated desires and memories that influence our behavior despite being usually inaccessible. Derrida argues that both archives and the mental apparatus deal with three distinct memory functions: inscription, storage, and retrieval of memory. This parallelism allows Derrida to claim that the theory of psychoanalysis is not only a theory of memory, but also a theory of the archive, or in other words, that archives can be explored psychoanalytically. Freud introduces his theory of the death drive in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, his most philosophical essay written in 1920. This essay examines the reason why the mind impels us towards unpleasant and often painful experiences. He focuses on the dreams of shell-shocked veterans from the World War I who suffered from traumatic neuroses. Their dreams were, and I quote, characterized by their reintroducing the patient again and again into the situation of his accident, a situation from which he awakens with renewed fright, fixations, familiar to us in hysteria, end of quote. Freud's main interest is why these dreams repeat themselves on a frequent basis, and he assumes that, and I quote, they seek to master the stimulus by developing anxiety, the lack of which was the cause of traumatic neurosis, end of quote. Through the reenactment of traumatic events in dreams, Freud explains that the mind tries to create the anxiety that was lacking during the original event. During this process, the mind ignores the emotional stability and well-being of the person in the present and goes beyond pleasure to the core of the traumatic event. This compulsion to repeat a traumatic event, known as a repetition compulsion, has an inherent quality always to point towards the past, which is something that fascinated Freud as new and radical and applies to all drives in general. Freud remarks that whereas drives are commonly perceived as urges that point towards change and development, In actual fact, they do the opposite. Organic drives point towards the restoration of previous states, thus they are conservative and regressive. Commenting on the nature of organic drives, Freud adds that, and I quote, "If every living being dies for internal reasons, returning to the inorganic, then we can only say that the goal of all life is death, and looking backwards, that the non-living existed before the living." End of quote. The drive that pushes a person towards extinction, towards an inanimate inorganic state, is therefore the death drive, thanatos, which through repetition compulsions appears in opposition to, but also in balance with the life drive, eros, the drive that is concerned with the creation and preservation of life. The life drive is topographically different from the death drive. The former is situated within living matter, whereas the latter operates silently from outside. When Freud first introduced the concept of the death drive in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he had doubts regarding its theoretical validity, but later, in Civilization and its Discontents, he admits that my views of the death drive have taken hold of me so strongly that I can no longer think in any other way. Based on the theoretical hypothesis of the death drive, Freud comments on certain clinical illnesses and argues that the death drive can be expressed in two ways. One that is outwards as a sadistic aggression, and another that is internal and expressed as masochism. He suggests that the externalization of aggression is imperative, as the same aggression can be directed inwards and cause self-destruction. This suggests that sadistic behavior is normal and also beneficial for the organism.
A similar evolutionary trend in the technological pharmacon can be observed not only in urban spatial memory, but cultural memory in general. In The Cultural Foundation of Human Memory, the psychologist Qi Wang claims that although memory is inherently private and personal, memory arises from, and I quote, "the interaction between the organism and its ecology in the course of phylogeny and ontogeny, and is profoundly collective and cultural." End quote. The interdependency between memory and culture and the processes in which they interact with and mutate alongside each other is of particular interest in this presentation, and culture's role as the primordial support of life as we know it is apparent. Children learn through the experiences of people before them, and one day utilize that knowledge as an agent and collect experiences through their own practices of ancestral experience. This process then repeats itself. The knowledge stored as memory is processed and influenced by cultural norms, then loses its privacy through processes such as socializing and publication. They are preserved and transmitted as a result, and this process has been made possible by the technicization of memory and accelerated by subsequent technical advances and cybernetics, which enables memory to be technically externalized, maintained, and supported, whether that is by institutions, corporations, or techno-volunteers. Technocultural theories of cybernetics show how biologically limited human memory become wired up to the memory of technical machines, and this is certainly a remedy to our memory obsession. I will attempt to explain this phenomenon and the implications of such technological advancement, starting with preceding analog technological developments. In the Salle des États, the largest room of the Louvre in Paris, hangs the painting of the Mona Lisa, an externalized memory of the wife of a rich Renaissance Italian merchant, Francesco da Giocondo. What has been a more private recalling of his wife's image is now an externalized piece of memory and a source of income for the Republic of France. It is said that the Mona Lisa took Leonardo da Vinci 16 years to paint. This is in stark contrast to my friend David taking a picture of his girlfriend at a dinner using his iPhone under a fraction of a second. From the cave paintings of the Neanderthals to the mass printing of the Bible in early modern Europe to snaps on our smartphones, technical memory has shrunk in size with regards to space, cost, and time. This technological evolution not only produced semiotic democracy with a growing number of people able to create and share culture freely, but also the economic democratization and mass adoption of memory technologies that has made recording and recalling memories externally much more effortlessly. The opportunity cost of recording and recalling memory using contemporary total recall devices, such as smartphones, tend to zero. This reflects a significant change that detached the dilemma between survival and externalizing memory. After all, it is not certain whether Mr. Da Vinci would have had enough food to survive on in order to finish the Mona Lisa if he had spent all his income to patron someone else to paint or sculpt the memory of his lover. The process of memory storage currently is operated by techno-volunteers and paid workers, so therefore it is no way as automated, intelligent, and instantaneously magical as it may have been portrayed to be. But nonetheless, it has never been easier to externalize memories technologically. This is a significant change because it made hoarding memory cheaper and accessible. Therefore, memory technologies preconditioned the contemporary obsession with memory as a remedy to memory overflow. I propose that this is a technological pharmacon, and it is both a remedy and a poison. The facade of the Presbyterian Church is ahistorically preserved in the form of a technical object propped up by construction technology. The technical facade is decoded from religious vernacular and re-encoded into the cultural history expression of its new host. Therefore, this technical object becomes an exchangeable memory implant in the process of valorization, which monetizes the non-technic capital of the church. Similarly, this process can be observed in cybernetic memories stored in machine banks, in which cybernetic memories get plucked out of history, mutated, and reassembled. However, it occurs in much higher frequency, intensity, and affordability using computational logic, and is turbocharged by AI technology. And as such, we are only recently beginning to understand the issues relating to the decade-long cybernetic memory experiment of the likes of social media. The creator of the Tesco Club card claimed the data is the new oil. It is a free discount card for customers of a leading British supermarket chain that also branches into telecom, retail banking, and clothing. The card trades discounted prices for user data. The data here is the extracted and externally recorded shopping behavior patterns in any of Tesco's grocery stores, petrol stations, and retail locations. These are data that may otherwise lay dormant and become lost or forgotten. This makes the Club Card project a neuro extension prosthetic that can be passively archived via uploading and conditionally accessed, analyzed, and fed back via downloading. It is processed according to use cases, and most importantly, is no longer private and inside of the memory producer. The data analysis process is engineered to maximize profit. Therefore, the logical thing to do is to simplify and disregard any other meaning behind the collected data and manipulate the statistics to suit business cases. Therefore, unlike the chronological development of memory technology, cybernetic memory can be stored externally, twisted from a straight line into a loop, temporally, and displayed spatially if a business case so requires. Therefore, this memory is reassembled and plotted across a synthetic achronological time, which can be exploited by private interests. As a result of the potential oil-like profit, it is obsessively promoted and accelerated by enabling technologies. Moreover, the poisonous commercial exploitation of externalized memory perpetuates the cycle of memory obsession amongst individuals by means of advertised promotions, financial incentives, and passive extraction. This obsession of memory needs to be offloaded somewhere, and the growing data center business as a techno remedy promises to fulfill the contemporary obsession of memory. The consequences of the physical methods of memory preservation, such as the facade retention construction activities mentioned earlier, are well understood and documented, even though a lot of the impact has been globalized and outsourced. However, the explosive techno-fixed pharmacon to our contemporary memory obsession, or the cloud, is less discussed given its apparent lack of tactile and physical local presence. And I will challenge this in the next section.
In the final part of this presentation, I will refer to one of my research-driven art projects that was showcased in the third Lisbon Architecture Triennial Closer in 2013. This is a Super 8 film and sound installation called Stage 3, The Retrieval of the Archive, Witnessing the Destruction of Seville, that was produced by a team of 5 people. For this project, we asked architecture students from University of Seville to consider a historically significant part of their city, Paseo de Cristóbal Colón in Seville and Calle Betis in Triana. That these are 2 historically significant streets in the center of Seville, running parallel to each other, but divided by a canal. Both streets feature a number of listed buildings and symbols of Spanish culture. The students were asked to debate and collectively decide on the buildings they would like to get rid of by marking the discarded ones on a map they were given. Using these markings as a guide, I recorded on Super 8 film the buildings of the 2 streets, including also the absence of the discarded building stock. The recording was done sequentially. In their precise location in filmic space and time, buildings destined to be discarded were conceptually destroyed by pointing the camera towards the sun, allowing the sunlight to burn the film's emulsion. This project allowed students to express the death drive. Following Freud's psychoanalytic theory, our drives must be in peaceful balance. We said earlier that the death drive has a 2-fold manifestation. One that is external and expressed as a sadistic aggression, and one that is purely internal and expressed as masochism. Both manifestations for Freud are normal, and in fact are necessary and beneficial for the organism. Evilness and aggression are parts of our nature, and they have to be externalized. In the essay Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud attributes the glory of civilization to the simultaneous workings of the life and death drives, where the death drive is diverted or sublimated. He states that civilization serves the life drive, or eros, which brings people together and makes them into a solid functional unit. He acknowledges, however, that among people there is also innate aggression, which reflects the working of the death drive, or thanatos. And he adds that the development of civilization is no longer obscure to us. It must show us the struggle between eros and death, between the life drive and the destructive drive, as it plays out in the human species. This struggle is an essential content of all life, and therefore the development of civilization can simply be characterized as the struggle for life of the human species. As the death drive is innate but essential to life, it is imperative that the evil and aggression with which it is expressed are sublimated, channeled creatively as a will to power. This is possible by abolishing the dualistic model of the life-death drive, according to which the death drive counteracts the righteousness of the life drive, and instead seeing the two as one fundamental positive force of our nature. With regard to conservation, this psychoanalytic approach accepts that progress in architecture is achieved through the equal workings or struggle of the life and the death drives, where destruction is not necessarily considered as something negative. After all, as Freud points out, our civilization would not develop unless it was constantly threatened by destruction. The same applies to buildings. Coming back to the installation at the Lisbon Triennial, the audience was invited to witness the conceptual destruction of Seville by stepping on the platform of the installation. Whilst on the platform, the audience was physically inside the rotating loops of the two Super 8 films being projected on the two opposing walls. The moving images of the Super 8 film installation were accompanied by a sound piece that was also inspired by the concept of the archive. Using found and forgotten cassettes, the interplay between recordings and white noise, or of life and death drives, emphasizes the significance of controlled destruction as a means to progress and develop.
When I was a student at University College London in 2022, we'd received documents to read sent digitally prior to our seminars. Of course, storing, sending, receiving, extracting, and reading the information at, to, from, and through the cloud digitally is the norm since the abrupt forced transition to online education as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The cloud's perceived benefits were recognized preceding the public health event, which arguably only accelerated the transition from the analog and physical to the digital and virtual. The paperless future is a concept that finds support in the student body as well, evident in the strong objection for crits with printed material on environmental grounds at the Biennale School of Architecture where I studied. It also finds support among some staff members who prefer the partial changes to online services and remote working. This technique of remote connection presents itself as a logical one, which above all seems to reduce the carbon footprint of their users. However, reading seminar text for 3 hours on a laptop emits around 136 grams of carbon dioxide, whereas receiving printed paper copies and reading for a near indefinite amount of time until the paper rots away emits 50 grams. The finding can largely be contributed to the carbon emission of data centers that store the documents, the energy consumption of withdrawing the data and powering the laptops, and it reveals the digital pharmacon to the environmental issues surrounding paper usage, which dislocate material harm remotely. Under the pretense of the clean and pristine cloud is a dark and dirty shadow that is unquestionably physically grounded, created and operated through extractivism of natural resources on land and of human labor. Whilst focus has been to reveal the environmental issues with data storage, transmission and calculation in the hidden technological media, the material impact of the digital archive and the true environmental cost of its supply chain is even more dislocated and hidden. For example, the dirty cobalt mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo is a frontier of the planetary mine. It deceives us and dislocates the extraction site away from the Western gaze through the technological revolution that led to globalization. According to Amnesty International, the industrial-scale mining activities for cobalt and copper has led to forced evictions, with communities forced away from their homes and farmlands and human rights abuses, including sexual assault. They are often forced or tricked into derisory settlements with no access to legal support or a sufficient grievance settlement system. Furthermore, the industrial-scale production is juxtaposed by the artisan miners that get invited back to the mining sites, some in their early teenage years and with only manual tools. Although the immediate cost to nature and people as a result of digital archive-led mining activities is self-evident, the end-of-life cycle of the tech industry that the digital archive is a part of is as poisonous, if not more so. The more than 50 million tons of e-waste needs to end up somewhere. The notorious Agbogbloshie e-waste site near the capital of Ghana produces an environment that is not suitable for human inhabitation, with toxic metals and fumes exposed to the desperate inhabitants extracting metal for survival. Diseases and crime run free as a result. The cloud renders the relationship to the earth as one of a hidden, unseen exploitation. The environmental exploitation is not only preconditioned by the contemporary obsession over memory that has led to a rapid growth of the digital archive, but also enabled by the colonial order of exploitation preserved by the neoliberal economic order. It is a less obvious kind of violent persecution of the human body that results from the environmental issues of the digital archive. This only starts to expose the violent tendencies of the digital archive. Firstly, the weak institutions left by the colonizers create so-called failed states that can be easily exploited by external forces where former colonizers can easily step in with existing ties. For example, the contemporary routing of underwater optic fiber cables from West Africa is via London, and South American internet providers are based thousands of kilometers away in Spain. These countries have no choice but to ask for money from the IMF, whose loans come with a hefty commitment to neoliberalism above all else, with a mandatory requirement to impose an austerity program and remove trade tariffs, which are all devastating as practices for developing countries. So the result is a fully intact colonial network and infrastructure that fuels the digital archive. It serves to fill the pockets of enablers of this neo-colonial network, which continues to violently exploit the likes of the teenage boys in the mines of the Congo, digging with their bare hands for copper in exchange for a subsistence wage to survive on. Secondly, carbon emissions from operating the digital archive contribute to climate change. It will inevitably affect everyone. However, it is disproportionate. The colonial legacy of weak institutions and the neoliberal imposition of free trade rules contributed to the destruction of domestic industries in the global south, and as a result are far more exposed to climate-dependent primary sector of agriculture. Therefore, the risk for conflict increases. The immigration flow to rich countries have hit an all-time high this year, and this trend is unlikely to subside as the global south continues to suffer from the impact of climate change. This is likely to be a violent process that will and has resulted in violence and suffering through trafficking on the borders of the EU, for example in Melilla near the shores of Lesbos and the English Channel. The EU's militarization of the border as part of its mitigation strategies against climate-induced migration makes it an armed lifeboat. The neo-fascist overtone that describes Europe as a garden that ought to be protected from the jungle that is the rest of the world is not my analysis, but the exact word of Joseph Borrell Fontelles, a top EU diplomat and ex-president of the European Parliament. Thirdly, the poison of the digital archive is not only manifested through the violent physical harm of the body, but also of the mind. It is further manifested through the rollout of interpretive violence using AI-powered algorithms at scale. Unlike the physical presence of the Presbyterian Church, digital memories are just zeros and ones that are mobile within cybernetic networks across state lines, walls, and facades. In the Tesco club card example, continuous memory data of the day-to-day of a person is turned into discrete data points via extraction and voluntary upload onto the digital archive. The memory pharmacon thus commits the same interpretive violence as London South Bank University, in which partial forgetfulness of the soul is encouraged with commercially irrelevant data disregarded or archived one layer deeper to prevent subject access. However, this time it is automated at scale and at a fraction of the cost using computational logic. It exposes the most private parts of one's memory to commercial interests and are in turn used against them. Memory, instead of being distorted by the prism of the present in a more natural biological process, is externally stored via the cybernetic memory remedy and distorted and molded by the owner of that digital infrastructure. Lastly, these memories would not have been recorded without the digital pharmacon, and yet it is being captured and data surgery is performed on them by the capital machine. Moreover, memories that would not have been noted down without the digital pharmacon are used more widely than at a British supermarket chain, A centralized algorithm has been developed to use them to form a new file community digital archive in a top-down manner. The centralized algorithm, for example, in the TikTok app, pushes different culture category-based content depending on where you live. It is well documented and publicized that it recommends content based on extracted user preferences. The content everybody receives is different, but resembles a community collection. The result is that users inorganically live in these unique, algorithmically created community archives. These archives have essentially one member, that is the user themselves. This quasi-curation is enabled by the abundance in the digital archive, and the result is comparable to a digital version of solitary confinement for its users. In the introductory observation, I talked about a contemporary obsession with memory. The technologically driven remedy of the digital archive suggests that by building more archives and hoarding more memory, albeit digitally this time, our memory obsession will be solved. However, this assumes that the digital archive can expand virtually in the cloud to a size that tends to infinity without the need to physically match the expansion. I have shown that the cloud is in fact made out of dirty hubs of violence, and the content within the digital archive is also subject to violence, mutation, and distortion. Therefore, the digital archive is a pharmacon. It presents itself as a remedy, but spreads its poison globally.
Back to Alain René's documentary Toute la mémoire du monde. The narrator comments on the capacity of the National Library of France to archive the increasing volume of printed material.
Édifiée en un temps où l'on imprimait peu, la Bibliothèque nationale s'enrichit maintenant de quelques 3 millions de volumes par siècle. Pour éviter l'éclatement, perpétuellement, elle s'enfonce plus avant dans le sol, elle s'élève plus haut dans le ciel.
The National Library must expand towards every direction to avoid bursting. Archives today follow the same fate. The overaccumulation of memory in both physical and digital forms creates archives on the verge of rupture. We therefore propose to address this issue through the prism of Freudian psychoanalysis. We propose the externalization of our death drive and the partial controlled destruction of the archive so that our drives, our life and death drives, can reach a state of peaceful balance, which, following Freud, is necessary for the progress and prosperity of our civilization. Thank you.
Thank you.